Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Truzansky. I am the Deputy Director with Building Bright Futures and really happy to have you on today. This is the second in a series of early childhood forums on mental health, focused on supporting kids and families through transitions during the coronavirus crisis, excuse me. BBF worked with panelists with us today and the Department of Mental Health. And I want to welcome one of my favorite partners from DMH, Cheryl Wilcox. Do you want to introduce yourself, Cheryl?
I would love to. Thank you, Beth. Cheryl Wilcox. I work with the Department of Mental Health. I'm the Interagency Planning Director and have the honor of being our representative from DMH on the Building Bright Future State Advisory Council. I really would like to thank on behalf of DMH, Beth, and all the work to put this together, and Dave and Megan for the time you took planning and preparing. I think, you know, in my day-to-day life, I am really lucky to be talking on a daily basis with mental health providers, but I also have gotten a special window into educators and what folks have been doing while I listen to my son on his online classes. And it is just incredible, the deep caring and commitment across the board from everyone interacting with children and youth, supporting them through this. And so I just really want you all to know how valued and appreciated you are. In my office space that I'm not in right now, because I'm working from home, as many of you are, I have a number of quotes that give me inspiration. And one of them is a Maori proverb, which is, "Turn your face to the sun and the shadows fall behind you." And it's one of my favorites. And I feel like in these challenging times, the light is all of you. And I really appreciate the incredible caring and passion that I see every day. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Cheryl. So given the rapidly changing world that we live in, you know, Building Bright Futures has been strategizing about how the coronavirus pandemic impacts the lives of children and families, and our role. And we recognize that this is changing rapidly. Today we hold a space in support of children and families and you professionals who are working with families. We know that this has called on us to be even more creative than we had to before. In many cases, trying to connect with families remotely, though that may be changing slowly. So we're happy to host this forum. It's really the sixth in a series around issues impacting kids and families. Our desired outcomes for today are to share information with professionals working with children and families to support mental health and support children through transitions during the coronavirus crisis, and to share stories and resources on where else to go for support. So just a few, as we start at BBF, we have made it a practice to start at the start of meetings, start with a mindful moment. So I invite you, if you'd like to turn off your video, you can, to do a few volcano breaths. And this is something that a colleague of mine shared with me. And a volcano breath, if you want to sit up straight or stand with your feet flat on the ground, and pretend your hands and arms are like lava flowing from a volcano. Start with your hands in the front of your heart with your palms touching. Keeping your hands together, reach straight up and breathe in. And separate your hands and move arms down to your side and breathe out. I'll let you do that a few times. Thank you. As we get started, a few notes on Zoom. First, we recognize that we are home, doing our best to tune in with lots of distractions. So take care of yourself. Babies, dogs, lunch, whatever you need to take care of yourself are welcome to join you on this forum today. We ask that you do stay muted unless you are asking a question. And to invite you to use the chat bar to introduce yourself. You can share your first name, where you work or where you're calling from today, and invite you also to offer resources or ideas to the community that we are joined here together today. Just to keep it positive and on topic. You can also adjust your view on Zoom. So you can use the presenter view if you want to have the speaker large on your screen, or the gallery view if you want to see all the participants. We invite you to keep your video on if you are able to. It's great as a presenter to be able to see people's engagement. We will leave that to you. So as you introduce yourselves, thank you folks for getting it going. Also to share one small way that you're supporting children and families right now. You recognize you're showing up in many different ways, perhaps as home visitors, perhaps as early childhood mental health practitioners. I am joined today by two guests. Dave Melnick and Meagan Roy, who work with kids and families and bring their expertise in child and family mental health. They will share information and resources, and then we will shift to question and answer and receive, you can also submit questions through the chat bar. We are recording this forum and we'll post along with the resources shared on the BBF website. So I am going to stop my share right now and hand this over to Dave to introduce himself and to share the resources on his screen as well. Hi, Dave.
Good morning. Let me just set up, make sure my screen's working for everybody to see. Beth, let me know if that's, and you're seeing just the one slide, not my notes version.
We can see your slide, yes.
Okay, great. So good morning, everybody. And Beth and Cheryl, thanks for inviting me, and Megan, it's great to present with you as well. I'm going to make a couple of introductory comments. My name is Dave Melnick. I'm from NFI Vermont. We're a statewide mental health agency, and I'm a clinical social worker. I've been doing this work for about 35 years. I'm really particularly pleased about being here this morning. I don't think it's any news to people that are on this webinar that the most important work that any of us can do is the work that we do for early childhood mental health and early childhood education. It's the most efficient and effective investment we can make, both in today and in the future. I'm going to make a couple of, just a couple of statements that I'm thinking are probably safe ground statements for the audience that we have. And then I'm going to ask you to get to work with me by drawing a stress curve in a second. A lot of my teaching goes directly through the stress curve. I believe that if we as adults, parents working and raising children have a grasp of what stress is and what it does to us, that we will be almost immediately better at everything that we do with children. I do want to state at the beginning that there's oftentimes a lot of negative bias about stress and misunderstanding about stress. One of the important things to know as we jump into that in a slide or so is that in order to have a meaningful life, by definition, you have to have a stressful life. And that may sound odd and unusual coming from somebody with from within mental health. I hope that by the end of the 20 or 25 minutes that I talk, that will become a little bit clearer. So a couple of comments. One of the things that's most important to me in my work, both as a clinical social worker with kids of all ages and working in schools where kids reside of all ages, and as a parent myself, is that far too often, even though we on the slide absolutely love and adore children, the point of entry for me most frequently and consistently is not with children. It's with the adults that work with children, whether that's in their professional role as teachers, preschool providers, daycare providers, or parents, or folks in schools or in mental health. The more we prioritize the point of entry being adults, the more likely we're taking good care of adults. When we take good care of adults, it's not automatic, but it's extremely likely that adults that are well taken care of will take good care of children. And so that's a pretty simple formula that amazingly we don't often follow. Most of us on this webinar, I suspect, would work ourselves to the bone before we practice well-being and participate in wellness initiatives. And I imagine there'll be some questions that come up a little bit later about well-being. To me, the simple fact is that adult well-being is an act of social justice, and it's an act of altruism. If you're not taking care of yourself, you are clipping the ability to work effectively with children. So I know that that's a hard sell for folks on the webinar, because particularly people that are raising and working with young children, I believe are amongst the most selfless people around. And so a few additional points. The relationships that children have with adults are central to their mental health. And adults are the most necessary element to protect children and to help them organize their response to stress and threat. The pandemic has introduced a level of threat and stress to most of us that, if not unparalleled, it is certainly increasing to whatever stress you had prior to this. Second or third point is that as we are the primary protectors against a child's danger, against any danger that's perpetrated on them and stress that they're exposed to, it's critically important to remember the three basics in moderating stress for kids. One is play and access to play and unfettered play and free play. The second is routine and structure, that all children, but particularly young children, thrive the most when their world is well structured and routined. And then the third, to me, most critical kind of central element around protecting children from stress and from danger is our capacity to co-regulate them. And so I'll speak a little bit more about that as we move along. So I'm going to ask everybody to, as quickly as you can, if you have not seen this before, this is the stress continuum. So you either can think about this as the stress response system, the stress continuum. I'm going to talk it through step by step. I think there's an incredible amount of wisdom in this stress curve. It was invented decades ago. It's been around for a long time. It reads from left to right, and I'll quickly narrate and describe what each of these different areas mean. The bottom line here, that line that you first draw, and then if you then draw the bell curve, the bottom line represents stress states. And starting from left to right, we go from low or no stress states all the way up to toxic stress states, which are unmanageable for human beings. So if you look at these four, they're worded and shown here as kind of discrete, separate stress states. But I want to clarify that in the real world, it's not always easy to determine where exactly you are on this stress continuum. So think about the bottom line as a continuum of stress, starting with low stress and no stress, which is a preferred place for us to be in some circumstances. The second stress state is mild to moderate. The function of mild to moderate stress is to optimize performance. And so I said something in the introduction that may have caught some people's curiosity, which is you cannot live a meaningful, productive life if you don't live a stressful life. And what's that's referring to is that one of the primary definitions I use around stress is the amount of energy in your body. When we have mild to moderate amount of energy in our body, we perform the best as human beings, regardless of what it is that you're doing. So whether you're teaching, whether you're learning, whether you're doing sports, whether you're playing an instrument, whether you're hiking, whether you're exercising, anything that human beings do is most optimally and high quality accomplished when we're able to keep our bodies in mild to moderate stress states. And so as we kind of work our way up this stress continuum, we go into increasing levels of stress. Everything on the left side of this bell curve would be considered positive or productive or generative stress. Everything on the right side of the bell curve is counterproductive and hurtful. What the bell curve itself represents in this diagram is performance. And so stress has an interesting relationship. Performance has an interesting relationship with stress because it shifts, and it shifts right at this dividing line. So I'll use my hands to kind of show this a bit. Early on in the stress cycle, on the left side of this bell curve, there is a positive relationship between stress and performance, which means as your stress increases, so does your performance. You simply get better at everything a human being can do as your stress level increases from no stress to mild stress to moderate stress. Then for most of us, when you hit that moderate stress threshold, there begins to be a degradation or a loss of performance. So this hand represents performance, this hand is stress. So initially they coincide with one another, then you hit a certain marker, and as stress increases, you perform worse and worse and worse. And so quite simply, one of the most important things for us to consider as people that are raising and working with children, very simply, is to understand the core concepts around stress, that as stress increases, performance does to a certain degree, and then there's a degradation of your skills on all levels with everything that you do when we find ourselves on the right side of the bell curve. And so 2 skills already that I would suggest that you consider, just based on very quick explanation of the stress curve. The first consideration is people in our business that are the best and parents that are the most productive and successful with their kids. The first thing that they do is in a dynamic way. That means throughout the course of the day, they can assess where on the bell curve they are. And so if you're a parent, a preschool teacher, a teacher, a mental health provider, and you're doing your work or raising your children and you're somewhere here, you're doing fantastic work with your kids if you're able to moderate and mediate your own stress. Conversely, if you find yourself on the right side of the bell curve, for mostly all of us, except the most resilient people, you're going to experience a degradation or a minimizing of your skill level. That isn't in and of itself a problem to be on the right side of the bell curve, because all of us that work with children and raise children will find ourselves on the right side of the bell curve. The problem isn't so much if you're on the right side of the bell curve. The problem is not knowing it. And so some of the most destructive, problematic things that adult human beings do to children is they do it when they're on the right side of the bell curve, and most concerningly is they're not even aware that they're in high stress states. So I want to give some characteristics so you can get a little bit more familiar with what you look like as an adult when you're on the right side of the bell curve. And so 4 or 5 characteristics that will help you clarify when you are beginning to move in the direction of counterproductive and possibly harmful levels of stress. The first characteristic is that for most of us, when we're in moderate to high stress states, we're not even aware of it. That's what makes us adults potentially so dangerous to children, is when we're in heightened stress states and we don't even know it. When we are and we're not aware of it, we have a diminished capacity to parent. Our skills again begin to erode and digress and degrade. Our ability to care for our children and for our students and for our clients, our capacity to care begins to get blocked, and primarily what's blocking our capacity to help our kids is stress. So think about on the right side of the bell curve, one of the things that happens to us as human beings is stress literally gets in the way between you and the child in a productive way. And it begins to obscure your view of what our primary tasks are with kids. Third thing that happens on the right side when we find ourselves as adults in moderate to high stress is our brain begins to close down and become more rigid cognitively. We stop thinking about what's good for kids, and we tend to get more focused on what our needs are, what our own survival needs are. We get more reactive, we get more short-tempered, and we're more likely when we're on the right side of the bell curve to blame kids, to blame our bosses, to blame the governor, to complain, and to shame. So if you're in a preschool or a daycare center with multiple adults, we have the benefit of having multiple adults, pay attention to colleagues when they're doing a lot of blaming, shaming, and complaining. That's not a sign of a bad person. That's a sign of a stressed person. And it's as clear a signal as many of us as adults can give that we're in moderate to high stress states and we need something from the people around us. Right side of the bell curve, we tend to get more self-focused on our own needs, and we can get panicky, detached, and anxious. Children, particularly little children, one of the lovely things about little kids is they're extremely transparent about where they are on the stress curve. That's not always the case of older children. There are older children that develop adaptive abilities to not reveal their inner affect states because they've learned in their families that that's just far too dangerous to do. For the most part, 0 to 6-year-olds are pretty transparent. So the signs and signals that a child is on the right side of the bell curve, and they will be there more frequently now with the sheltering at home, the stress level that adults are experiencing. If adults in the lives of children are stressed, it's almost impossible for a child not to be stressed. That's not necessarily true of a 9, 13, 15, and an 18-year-old. As children age, they develop the ability to self-regulate, and they can immunize themselves a little bit more from the stress of the adults around them. That's just not the case with 0 to 6-year-olds. They are a direct reflection of the stress experiences that the adults are having around them, plus their own stress experience of what's going on internally and what's going on externally in their environment. So the obvious signs and signals that a child's on the right side of the bell curve is that they tend to get clingy and anxious and picky and finicky and fussy. They can get aggressive, they can yell, they can bite, they can spit, they can have temper tantrums. They can be short-tempered and reactive. They can be extremely self-focused, more than what is typical for 0 to 6-year-olds who should be self-focused. And something that most of us are paying very careful attention to now, which is a lot of kids are in a regressive state, both because of the stress that they're experiencing and because of the ambient kind of baseline stress that's in the community, not just their parents, but what's going on in the greater Vermont community, in the national and the global community. Although kids don't cognitively understand that, they physiologically understand it. Their bodies feel exactly what's going on around in the communities. And then a final determinant when a kid's on the right side of the bell curve is that there's disturbances in their eating, their sleeping, and their toileting habits. And so it's important for us to recognize when you're seeing these kinds of symptoms, particularly in the 0 to 6 population, it is not by choice. Children are not choosing to do these things. It's something that they do as an alert signal. They are designed as young children to alert us that they're in dysregulated states. Most 0 to 6-year-olds are not furnished with complicated language to let us know that. So one of the most concrete tasks that we have to do as adults and as caregivers is it is our job to interpret these behaviors as signs of moderate to high stress and engage with kids in ways that communicate to them that we understand that they're in moderate to high stress. While discipline is a component of moderating stress, it often has diminishing returns, particularly when stress levels are as high as they are for most of us as adults and for most of the children that we're caring for. Some of the very basic, and this is going to be a review for most of you, and I may say it in a way that's slightly different than how you think of it, but the 5 or 6 things that are most critical, and then I think I'm going to stop and yield to Megan. The 5 or 6 most critical strategies to moderate stress, to move kids from the right side of the bell curve to the left side of the bell curve are, and they're in a little bit of an order. I had a hard time ordering the first 4 or 5 because they're all critically important, so I just put them in some kind of order. Number 1, One of the ways that we as adults, for ourselves and for children, and even more important now because of COVID-19, structure, routine, and rituals decrease uncertainty. And so the more that we can provide somewhat rigid right now, structure, routine, and rituals, that doesn't mean we don't allow children to play freely, but it does mean that meal times, bedtimes, reading times, academic times, outdoor times, fun times, tickling times, the more we are adherent to a level of structure and routine, the safer and more certain the child feels, even though there's parts of our country that are blown up right now. Second critical skill, and many of you do this remarkably well. It is an essential skill in the 0 to 3, 0 to 4 population, and it continues to be important during early childhood mental health and education. And that is the capacity for us as adults to narrate inner world experience for kids. Young children cannot make the connections between what's going on inside their bodies and what they need. So they often cry or they fuss, and they need us to interpret their inner worlds. They often are confused about things that are going on in the external world. So one of the primary tasks of parents and providers early on in a child's life is in almost constant way we're narrating their inner experience. If you have an infant at home, you're spending the lion's share of your day with a 4 to 6 to 8 to 9 month year old, literally narrating different state changes inside their bodies. So you'll say, "Oh, sweetie, I know you're really hungry. Mommy's going to feed you." You're using words that they don't yet understand, but they respond to the cadence, they respond to the nonverbal, to the rocking, and eventually you use repetitive language so much that by the time they're 2 or 3, they can start saying scared, hungry, tired. And they do that because they've had the benefit of us narrating their internal experience for years and in thousands and thousands of repetitions. Number 3, stress is consistently regulated when we're empathic and validating, and often empathic and validating before we're reassuring. Reassurance is critical to young children, but so is empathy, feeling what they feel, and validating, authenticating their experience of the moment, even though it might be different than the experience that we're having of the moment. Fourth importance, again, not in a particular order, is physical contact, nurturing physical contact, body movement. Number 5 is the capacity to play, non-directed play. Young children do a variety of work through play. They regulate their stress, they let go of the day's anxieties, they problem solve, they resolve conflicts, they negotiate power and control with their peers and with play items. Number 6 would be, again, movement, dancing, singing, art, drama. The younger the child, in this population 0 to 6, they need expressive abilities to articulate their stress states. Language is limited in this population. And then I'd want you to think about the 4 R's. And so I'm not listing, this is not a tireless list of things that moderate stress, but what I want you to think about is that any activity that you can think of that meets the 4R criteria is going to help regulate a child's stress. The first R is whatever activity you choose, it has to be repetitive. You have to do it over and over and over again to regulate stress. Number 2, it has to be rhythmic. The human brain is attuned to rhythms of rocking, throwing a ball, back rubs, tapping, singing, humming. So it's got to be repetitive. It's got to be rhythmic, whatever the activity is. It's got to be relational. So number 3 is relational. It's got to be between you and another child, and a child. It's got to be interpersonal. And number 4, it's got to be rewarding, and not rewarding in, you get a pencil or a sticker. It's got to be rewarding in the sense that it feels good to the kid's body. So back rubs feel good, walking and talking feels good, singing together feels good, dancing feels good, shooting baskets together feels good. That's the 4 R's. And then I'll leave with, and the 4 R's and the 3 R's come from the work of Bruce Perry. Many of you are familiar with him, one of the one of the world's leading traumatologists. He talks about that as you get us as adults, as caregivers, as parents, as we get more and more sophisticated in our understanding of stress and stress states, we have to recognize that depending on where the child is on the stress continuum will determine the general category of how we respond to them. So I'm roughly going to cut this bell curve into 3 slices. When a child is in this stress state, moderate to high stress, the R that they need there is regulation. Not a lot of talking, a lot of nonverbal support, a lot of back rubs, a lot of breathing, a lot of singing, a lot of nurturing physical contact. So when a child is in high stress states, they need us to co-regulate or regulate their physiological system, their body system. We most effectively do those kinds of things non-verbally. It doesn't mean don't talk to kids, but when your baby's screaming, probably 70 to 80% of what's comforting them is the rocking. Maybe another 20, 30% is the soothingness of your voice. When people are in these more moderate, mild to moderate stress states, then the R that we use there is our relationship with the kid. Conventional, we're using empathy and validation and narrating their inner world. Narrating the inner world here could often be dangerous and destructive. It would often feel too intimate to a kid to talk about what's going on inside them. Here, we're more nonverbal. We're using more physiological interventions. In the mid-range here, we're using our relationship, empathy, validation, play. And then when a child is better regulated right around here, then we're using reason and logic. Don't do that. Daddy doesn't like that. Teacher, a teacher says now you're going to have to sit with me because you've been hurting your friends. So children only understand reason and logic when they're moderately to mildly stressed. Otherwise, our logic and our reason doesn't make sense to them. I'll yield there and look forward to some conversation after Meagan chats for a bit. So I will stop share. Meagan, that should open things up for you.
That is such helpful information. I know a lot of folks are asking for some follow-up, so we'll make sure we get this information off to others. I am going to share again. Welcome, Meagan Roy. Meagan, do you want to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on your perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Beth, and thanks, Dave. I'm Meagan Roy. I'm the Director of Student Support Services for the Champlain Valley School District, just finishing my 9th year there and almost 20th as an educator in Vermont. And so much of what Dave shared resonates and probably resonates with all of us. And so what I'm hoping to talk a little bit about is just from the perspective of educators, people in the schools or actually right now at home trying to teach, what can we do to support our adults? Because the piece of what Dave started with, which is we can't take care of kids adequately until we take care of ourselves, is absolutely true. For educators, this pandemic, so in the midst of the uncertainty that many adults have about work and whether or not we will still have work and whether or not our spouses have work, where our kids are, just the health stress, we're also being asked to reinvent our craft and completely rethink how we deliver instruction to kids. Many of us are doing that while we have our own kids at home. I know that's a reality for me. And sometimes it's nice to be able to get out for a little while and be in your office, but often you're at home. Many of you have probably had kids walk behind your camera and tap you on the shoulder. It's stressful. So what I hope to share a little bit about is just kind of what in our schools, and this is K-12 education. It is very much the same in early education. If anything, it's more complicated because some of you
are still working, still seeing kids in person. Some of you are not. Some of you are getting ready for that, and that in and of itself is really stressful. Some of you have been teaching remotely. So some of what I'll talk about is the extent to which we can take people where they are. So you can scroll back down to the, let's see, this one. Yep. So these next couple slides are not new to you because you hear this from your families, but families and our educators, I feel like the stress that each of them go through go hand in hand. And the best way that I can support the educators in my system is to help them understand what the experiences of families. So families are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed at school being closed or childcare being closed. Some of them are able to kind of engage with any distance learning that's happening, and some aren't. They're uncertain about what's next. So in K-12 education, they're uncertain about the fall because we know we're not coming back. But in childcare, they're uncertain right now. Many of you are reopening. You're thinking about what that looks like, and families aren't sure how they feel about that. You can advance, Beth. And what we hear from teachers is the same thing. They're overwhelmed. They miss their students. All of you that are early childhood educators miss seeing your kids every day. Those of you that have had to figure out remote learning, and remote learning in K-12 education is very hard. Remote learning for early education is nearly impossible. It's really, really difficult. You also might have your own children at home. And a lot of teachers are uncertain about what's next. What will school look like? So what will childcare look like as we reopen with all of these restrictions? How do we plan? We're actually pretty good at planning. But right now, we don't know the parameters that we're being asked to do. And we also don't know whether or not our professional structure is going to work with our home structure, because anyone who is a parent has sort of both ends. So everybody's stressed, so you can advance that. Everybody's kind of on that bell curve. They are probably to the right. So you can go on to the next one. You know, in terms of working with the teachers in your program, many of you are teachers, some of you are directors. Our job is to do what we can to fill their cups, right? And an empty cup has nothing to pour into someone else's. It's the put your oxygen mask on first. And that's really hard to do right now because there's so much unpredictability. One of the most important things that makes educators feel better is knowing what comes next, because at least they can prepare for it. We don't have a lot of that. So what we try to do in our system is communicate what we know when we know it, but also communicate the unknown. We have had a lot of conversations, and our ability to do this, I recognize, varies based on your program, your situation, but we try to work with adults and be flexible on how the work gets done. So some teachers have very, very young kids at home, and that's really difficult to find 20 minutes to deliver a lesson. Others have, you know, college age kids who are able to entertain themselves, but some are caring for parents. So it's really important, I think, to identify high-level priorities and be able to help your staff understand where they are. If you think of the stress curve and people's ability to take in information and ability to do their work, it's like we need to know that about the staff in our system so that we know, is this person on the far right, and therefore the only thing they can take in is very little, and actually the only thing they can take in is our care for them, or are they in that middle stage? And then you can build on the relationship that you had beforehand. You really have to take your staff where they are. The third bullet, and I only put a couple of links in here because there is actually so much incredibly useful information out around taking care of yourself, actually around everything. From taking care of yourself, taking care of kids, there's also so many resources coming out everywhere around how to do your work remotely. So you want to provide those tools and resources, but you really want to be aware of unintended pressure to use them. And that has a lot to do with knowing where your staff is, really knowing where your staff is on that stress curve. Because for some, just by you sharing a piece of information is going to be the straw that causes them not to be able to take anything in. So you really have to kind of be careful about where they are. You can go on to the next slide. And I feel the same way about families. And again, these two things go hand in hand. Teachers feel better when their families feel better. Some of these things Dave covered, but one of the things when we're communicating with families, remember, who are also stressed, they don't know what school or childcare is going to look like, we have to kind of normalize the uncertainty. That's where we are right now. I know last week you had Cindy Cole shared social stories and how you can talk to very young kids about what's going to be the same in school and what's not going to be the same. In some ways, you want to do that same thing with your adults and with your families. So here, families, here's what we know. Here's what we know will be the same. Here's what we know will be different. And help families know how to normalize that uncertainty with their kids. Take families where they are. So if you're in any sort of program right now that has been actively developing remote learning, you know that you're working really hard to develop things that families can engage in. And you really want to share that information. And sometimes when a family's reaction is, there's no way that I can log into your morning meeting, or there's no way I can implement that schedule you gave, that can feel disheartening because you've put a lot of effort in. If you can help families understand that schedule piece, that structure that Dave talked about, and how important it is for kids still to have that, that doesn't mean that from 9 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock is your academic time every single day, but it does mean that you get up at the same time, you have breakfast, you do things in the same order. So help families kind of support that gentle structure. One of the things, I won't have you flip slides yet, Beth, but the last slide on this, and I'm sure it'll be shared, is actually an example of that gentle structure. So how can you help families know, here's some things you can do with your kids, but there's not a lot of pressure. These are very easy activities to implement. So working with them on that. The last thing that we hear a lot is just fears about so for us, we hear a lot about academic and social emotional readiness for the next grade in K-12, but for you, it's the next classroom, or our kids gonna be ready to come back. And they're really worried that their kids aren't gonna be ready because they missed so much school. We try really hard to help families understand that it's not your kid's job to be ready for school. It's our job to be ready for your child. And that's what educators have been working on. That's what you all are working on as you prepare to open, whether you opened Monday or whether you're opening soon, is just to kind of take them where they are. So that's all I have in terms of content. Happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Megan. Here's the screen, the slide that has a schedule. We've gotten a lot of questions. If these slides will be available, we are recording this forum, and we can make the slides available on the BBF website as well.
Can I say something?
Yep, go ahead, Dave.
So, Megan, I love what you said. I thought it was incredibly clear. And particularly that last part about it's not the kids' jobs to be ready. There's so much uncertainty. I think that's an incredibly empathic, kind of beautiful sentiment to have. It makes sense a lot for coming from CVU district, because I think that's the spirit of the place and of the community, the schools throughout that district. I do want to make a comment about uncertainty, and probably the term that a lot of people are seeing these days is prolonged uncertainty. And while I do not want to minimize at all that for many of us, this might be the most profound experience of prolonged uncertainty in our lives, that's not the case for many people in our communities. If you're Black and brown, if you're in part of a subjugated class, if you're growing up in poverty or living in poverty, uncertainty has probably been a definitional characteristic of your life. So I want to be really careful around people, me, white person, middle age and middle class, upper middle class, saying, oh my gosh, this level of uncertainty is unparalleled. It's just simply not. And so one of the things that I take as one of my responsibilities is talking with people, colleagues, friends that either are of color or grew up in poverty when I did not. So I can get some of the wisdom of how do you survive when uncertainty has been your life story long before COVID-19 ever showed up.
Thank
Was
you.
there, Beth, was there some themes in the questions?
Yeah, I can read one comment from Liz. She says, one of the topics I've heard come up is how to continue to support and sustain long-term overall wellness for not only children, but the caregivers supporting families. Are there recommendations to sustain mental and physical wellness?
Yeah, I don't, Megan, you want to start on that?
Nope, you go ahead.
I think the formula that we have, one of the things I've been saying to myself over and over again and to whoever will listen is this is not the time to recreate the wheel. I'm estimating about 70% of the strategies, interventions, well-being, self-care, things that we could think of, we already invented. So I go 70-30 on this. 70% of what we have to do, regardless of how long this pandemic goes on, are traditional healing practices, either that you use in your family, your culture uses, your school uses, your setting uses. You were trained in mental health to use it. You were trained in mindfulness to use it. So I would estimate about 70% of what we've got to continue using, regardless of how long this is exactly what we've used in the past. It's not time to throw those away. Those have served us, and we survived as a species because we know how to regulate long periods of time of uncertainty. It literally is in our DNA to know how to survive long-term during uncertain times. The 30% to me is about innovation, and innovation only occurs, in at least my experience of innovation, is when we're talking to each other. So I think to me, collaboration and connectivity between us as adults is going to be more important than ever before. And so on one of these fact sheets that I helped write and sent around is the expression that I use is, now is the time to keep your inner circle closer and expand your outer circle. I'm in touch, and I'm hearing lots of stories of people. I'm in touch with people that I went to college with, I went to high school with, that I haven't been in touch with, because there just feels to be like a biological drive to check in and make sure people are okay. Every time I check in with somebody that's outside my inner circle, I have the opportunity to hear about the 30% innovations of what they're doing to make it through this really difficult time. So I'm leaning heavily, like most of us are, on my family and my inner circle, my most intimate friends and family members. But man, I'm casting a wider net than I ever have before, because I need that. And I think species wide, we need to do that. Keep your close people close and think about how do you broaden it out, because the inventiveness that I'm already hearing, and most of my work is with schools around the state of Vermont, the inventiveness and innovation that's going on, particularly in school settings, is mind-boggling. What schools have accomplished, I mean, we're talking about 2.5 months of what schools have accomplished. To me, it's just, I get chills when I think about what's happening in my setting, in mental health settings, in preschool settings. So I would also leave our minds open to the innovation and the newness that's getting developed, and the silver linings that are emerging as we're suffering together.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen a couple of questions, and I've heard this elsewhere around the concerns around teaching the social emotional impacts of mask wearing, particularly for adults. And this is in part this is the health guidance that many providers are dealing with. And so I don't know if either of you can speak to kind of other tools that we can call on to be able to connect with kids, even if we're wearing a mask.
One of the things, we're hearing that question a lot too, and it is still, it's only now starting to become real as childcare reopens and kids come back, and as we start to think about what summer could look like. And one of the things that we're talking a lot with about our teachers is, one of the ways to help kids with that is to start to normalize it. And I know for me, in the very beginning of this, when we had to put on a mask to go to the grocery store, that felt really uncomfortable to me. And now it feels a lot less uncomfortable. So if we can take that understanding of we are all getting used to something. Maybe we're, there are ranges of how comfortable we are, but for kids, it really is helping them understand, why are we doing this? And this goes to that, there's a million resources. There are video social stories. There are, little teachers are filming themselves so they can see, and then they're putting their mask on so that kids coming in will say, oh, now I know what they look like from here up. There's so many ways to do that. But I think that's what we're working on with our staff. If we are comfortable with it, kids will be comfortable with it. And you can still rock, and if you're a preschool teacher, kids will still crawl in your lap even with your mask. And we're also teaching flexibility. There are some kids who aren't going to be able to keep masks on, certainly very young kids, but also older kids. And that's okay too. And so that's what I would start with, is make it feel normal and comfortable.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think that question, I think early childhood mental health and early childhood educators are going to be so far above the rest of folks that work with children, because you already use your face as a primary tool of working with children. You use expressions. So I think what I'm beginning to practice is a little bit more vividness with eyes. If it is a little scary and off-putting for human beings to not read the face and the chin and the bottom part. But I think you're so good at being expressive, both with the upper side of your face and with your bodies. And so I find myself, even on these webinars, being more expressive with shoulders and arms. And I think that's what we're going to have to do. I think we're going to have to take a page out of what early childhood experts do, even when we're working with, you change the language, certainly in working with teenagers, middle schoolers, and elementary school kids. But I think the more body-based approach that you use automatically is going to be incredibly serving as we go back to getting used to this, because whatever this newness of masks are, for whatever period of time we have to do that.
And a couple of people too are also pointing out there are certain professions that really actually need a different method than the mask. Our speech and language pathologists, we are investigating shields, clear shields. There are face masks that are accommodated for people who read lips. I mean, there are certainly very practical reasons why we need to think differently about it. And I think there are resources for that too.
Thank you all. So as we, I would say that as a parent, one of the most challenging things is that, and both of you spoke to the challenges in being able to plan or knowing what the criteria will be next week or next month. I wonder, and so as we're trying to support kids and families through transitions, and we can't necessarily paint exactly what that other side will look like, I wonder if there's any reflections on kind of how do we lean into either the ambiguity or kind of be able to support kids in whatever we do know, whatever those knowns are.
I can start by saying, I did talk about normalizing uncertainty. That's part of it. But the other thing that I think that we can do as educators is to be clear about what isn't going to change. And the what isn't going to change is our care for kids, our desire to figure out where they are and what they need and bring it to them. And I know that maybe that sounds very fluffy to people, but that is what isn't going to change. Whatever our mission as an education system is, and that varies a little bit per system or childcare program. But you have a way that you approach education in your system. That part's not going to change. And again, that's only a small piece of reassurance. But I think sometimes that's really important because it helps families understand, well, when we decide what we will do with these health guidelines, it's going to be in the context of that, what we believe about.
Yeah, Megan, I agree. And I don't think that's soft and fluffy at all. I think it's very tangible. I think focusing on, I think the combination of what you said of what's going to remain constant, that's critical for kids of all ages, but particularly the younger the kid is. Honesty is important, and that we're going to be honest at different levels of what developmentally a kid can handle, the kind of information. I think I think we as adults have to communicate that we got this. That the older the kid, the more I'm going to be collaborative with a 10-year-old differently than I'm going to be collaborative with an 18-year-old and differently with a 3-year-old. The 0 to 6, the message is I got it and we got it as adults. As frightening as it is, it's our responsibility to be both honest and reassuring. And I think part of what we have to do to continue to mitigate stress over the long run is to partialize and break things down where you might have dealt with your schedule with your kids on a 2-day basis. It's really about what are we doing today? What are we doing this morning? What are we doing this afternoon? One of the kind of central ethics of social work is we break big problems down into small pieces because you can't ever solve a big problem unless you're solving it piece by piece by piece. And I think that that's important. It's going to continue to be important that we just partialize things as best we can into digestible pieces for the kid, depending on their age and their developmental stage and their cognitive capacity. I wanted to just also, I think it was Courtney or Cassandra that said, when I was going big with my affect, I didn't mean to imply that's the only affect speed you would have with kids. Of course, there are times that you have to soft tone things, and this would be intimate. You wouldn't do this to a 6-month-old or a year-old or an upset 4-year-old. And so I was just trying to illustrate the importance of using your face and your body as a primary instrument, of communication and soothing.
Thank you all. We are coming up on our time. Fascinating and a great topic. So thank you to our guests and to everyone who joined us today. Really great discussion and certainly some information to lean into. We were recording today, and that will be shared with the presentation up on the Building Bright Futures website. Many folks have asked around professional development credit, and so if you are a provider looking for credit, there's some guidance there, which is state email info@buildingbrightfutures with your name, place of employment, and BFIS number. We are also at Building Bright Futures capturing stories of resilience of communities and families working together. So please share those stories and tags hashtag Vermont Strong Kids. And then the last piece, little resource is encourage you to lean on Help Me Grow at calling 211 extension 6. If you are looking for a resource and you don't even know where to start, that our friends over there will help you figure out where to go and who to call. So we are coming up to time. Thank you, Megan and Dave, for joining us. Really great information, and we wish everyone well this afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.